This catastrophe does not arrive in an afternoon. There is no flash, no wave, no shaking ground. It arrives the way a season arrives, slowly, quietly, and then, all at once, one winter is colder than it should be, then the next, then a decade of winters that no longer resemble the winters your parents described. The great ocean current that carries warmth toward the North Atlantic has weakened and collapsed. It is the slowest catastrophe this channel will ever cover, and one of the largest. This is scenario 0. Today, could you survive the collapse of the Atlantic current? The ocean is not still. It moves in vast, connected currents that carry heat around the entire planet. One of the most important of these systems flows through the Atlantic. It is sometimes called the Atlantic Conveyor. This system carries an enormous amount of warm water from the tropics toward the far North Atlantic. As that warmth is released into the air, it moderates the climate of the lands nearby, most famously of Northern and Western Europe. This is why much of Europe is far milder than its latitude would suggest. Cities in Northern Europe sit as far north as the cold reaches of Canada, yet they enjoy mild winters and temperate summers. A large part of the reason is the warmth the Atlantic current delivers. So here is the central fact of this episode. This current is not guaranteed. It is a system, a balance, and balances can be tipped. If the Atlantic conveyor were to weaken and stop, the warmth it delivers would stop with it. What drives this enormous current? The answer is density. The conveyor is powered in large part by water becoming heavy and sinking in the far North Atlantic. Here is how it works. Warm water flows north at the surface. As it travels, it cools and it grows saltier through evaporation. Cold, salty water is dense. It is heavy. In the far north, it becomes heavy enough to sink, and that sinking pulls the whole conveyor forward. Now, the vulnerability, that sinking, depends on the water being salty enough to be dense. If a large amount of fresh water, water with no salt, is added to the North Atlantic, the surface water becomes lighter. Lighter water resists sinking, and here is the concern climate scientists raise. A warming world adds fresh water to the North Atlantic in two ways: increased rainfall and meltwater from ice. If enough fresh water accumulates, the sinking slows. As the sinking slows, the whole conveyor slows, and a slowing conveyor is a system moving toward a tipping point. A tipping point is the dangerous part. The conveyor does not only slow in proportion to the fresh water added beyond a certain threshold, the slowing can become self-reinforcing, and the system can shift over years to decades into a new, much weaker state and stay there. Every other scenario on this channel has an hour 0. This one does not. A conveyor collapse unfolds over years to decades. Its timeline is not measured in hours after impact. It is measured in the slow transformation of a climate. Year 1 to 10. The first signs are subtle and easy to dismiss. Winters in Northern Europe and Eastern North America run colder. Cold snaps are sharper and longer. Each individual winter can be explained away, but the trend across a decade is unmistakable. The effect is regional, not global, and this is crucial to understand. A conveyor collapse does not cool the whole planet. It redistributes heat. The lands around the North Atlantic cool sharply. Other regions may warm. Weather patterns worldwide shift as the atmosphere adjusts to a changed ocean. Year 10 to 30. The shift becomes a crisis of agriculture. Farming depends on reliable growing seasons. Colder, shorter seasons across the affected regions reduce yields of the crops. Those regions have always grown. Farmers must change what they plant, and changing a region's agriculture takes years. And there is a cruel twist. The collapse also shifts rainfall. Some regions that depended on reliable rains become drier. Monsoon systems far from the Atlantic can be disrupted. A conveyor collapse, in the end, is not a local cold snap. It is a worldwide rearrangement of where the weather works. Because this disaster is slow, it is also, in one sense, survivable. In a way, the others are not. There is time to see it, time to adapt, but the scale of the adaptation required is enormous. Energy is the first great strain. Regions built for mild winters suddenly need far more heating. Homes, power grids, and fuel supplies designed for a gentle climate must be upgraded for a harsh one. This is a vast, expensive, decades-long reconstruction. Food is the second. The affected regions can still grow food, but different food in different ways, often less of it. The global food trade would have to rebalance around new patterns of where crops can and cannot be grown. This is possible. It is also a profound disruption. And then there is the human response. As some regions become harder to farm and to heat, and others are disrupted by drought, people move. Large, sustained migration within countries and between them is one of the most likely long-term consequences of a conveyor collapse. This is the honest scale. A conveyor collapse does not kill a region in an afternoon. It tests whether societies can adapt over decades to a climate that no longer matches the cities, the farms, and the borders that were built for the old one. The hardest question of this scenario is whether the collapse can be undone, and the honest answer is sobering. Once the conveyor has shifted into a weak state, it does not simply switch back. The same self-reinforcing behavior that drove the collapse also stabilizes the new state. A weak conveyor changes the ocean in ways that keep it weak. Restoring it would require reversing the conditions that caused the collapse and then waiting, possibly for a very long time. This is why scientists describe major climate tipping points with such seriousness. A hurricane ends, an earthquake ends, even a volcanic winter clears, but a conveyor collapse could define the climate of the North Atlantic for centuries. A change measured not in the span of a recovery, but in the span of history. And yet, and this matters, a conveyor collapse is not the end of the world. It is a regional climate catastrophe that humanity would live through, adapt to, and over generations build a new stability around, harder, colder, poorer for a long time, but survivable if the adaptation begins early. So, the question this episode has promised to answer: could you survive the collapse of the Atlantic current? This scenario is different. It is slow, and so the honest answer is not about a kit for a single bad week. It is about adaptation over a lifetime. First, If you live in an affected region, think about heat. A slow-onset cold climate makes a well-insulated home and a reliable, ideally non-electric, backup heat source genuinely important, not for one storm, but for decades of harder winters. This is a long-term investment in where you live. Second, think about food resilience. The familiar scenario, zero pantry, still applies for the sharp cold snaps and disrupted supply that a shifting climate brings. Water, shelf-stable food, a hand-crank radio, flashlights and batteries, a first aid kit, a long supply of medication, and cash. But over the long term, resilience also means understanding where your food comes from and supporting local, climate-adapted agriculture. Third, be willing to think long. A conveyor collapse is the rare scenario where the right response is not a weekend of preparation, but a slow series of life decisions: where you live, how your home is built, what skills you hold. The people who adapt best to a slow catastrophe are those who see it early and adjust steadily rather than denying it until it is upon them. And the last thing, as always, is not a supply. It is community, and over decades, it is the most important factor of all. A slow catastrophe is endured by societies, not by individuals. Towns that invest together in heat, in housing, in adapted farming, and in caring for their most vulnerable will pass through a changed climate intact. The future, in this scenario, belongs to communities that plan together. How likely is a collapse of the Atlantic conveyor this century? This is an area of genuine, active, scientific debate, and the honest answer reflects that uncertainty. What scientists broadly agree on is this: the Atlantic conveyor has measurably weakened. A warming climate adds fresh water to the North Atlantic, which works against the current, and the system has tipping point behavior, meaning a full collapse is physically possible. What scientists debate is the timing. Some assessments consider a full collapse this century unlikely, though possible. Others warn it could come sooner than once believed. The honest framing is this: a conveyor collapse is not a certainty, but it is a serious, credible risk, and it is one of the clearest reasons that the slow catastrophes deserve the same attention as the sudden ones. We do not run this channel to scare you. We run it because the most useful question a person can sit with periodically, calmly, without panic, is: what would I actually do? Not in theory, across the decades a slow catastrophe would take to arrive. If you found this scenario useful, subscribe to Scenario Zero. We are going to spend a lot of time in the dark hypothetical so that in the bright real, you are slightly more ready than you were this morning. Yes, in closing, no cadence promise.